The following presentation was given at the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Tupelo in Tupelo, Mississippi. All are welcome to join us on Sundays at 11 a.m. at 1301 Marshall Street in Tupelo.
My grandmother was born in 1903. She was one of 12 children. Her youngest sister was born in 1911. Aunt Kath graduated valedictorian from her small high school in North Louisiana around 1928. And unlike most kids at the time, she headed off to college. Sometime in the next few years, she made what was for her a terrible mistake. She married. Now, I have no idea what went wrong, but she wanted out of the marriage. And let's be frank, divorce at that time was rather taboo. Even so, she reached out to my grandmother for help, and she got it. The only two options then, and they're the same now, were to divorce or get an annulment. My grandmother helped her get a legal annulment. For all practical purposes, the marriage never happened. My aunt was 102 when she died in 2013. I recently pulled up her obituary, and of course it said nothing about this event. My sister and I aren't even sure her family knows about the annulment, and we're not going to tell them. And to put these legal efforts into context, this all happened during the Great Depression. Nothing was easy for anyone during those years, but my grandmother helped make it happen. Her courage for taking on a very difficult issue and helping her baby sister is inspiring. And just to provide a little more global context and to demonstrate how things have drastically changed, just a few years later, in 1936, the King of England abdicated his throne because he wanted to marry a divorced woman. Today, if Prince Charles ever becomes the King of England, both he and his current wife are divorced from their original spouses. Change happens when courageous people take on the unrealistic requirements of the status quo. Moving on, my mother began teaching high school in 1948. By the early 70s, she was somewhat of an institution at that same school, which was also my high school. Now, I'm not clear whether there was an actual rule against it, but many of the women teachers at her school approached my mother and asked her to wear a pantsuit as opposed to a dress. They believed if she could get away with it, they all could. She did, and they all began wearing pantsuits. Now, you might laugh, but putting this into perspective, in 1994, I worked in an office in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That winter, we had 65 inches of snow, and the women there asked if they could wear pants to work on snow days. For some odd reason, they didn't want to shovel snow in dresses. Once again, change happens when courageous people take on the ridiculous expectations of the status quo. And one final example. My mother-in-law, Jean Joyner, was a registered nurse in Leake County, Mississippi. In the 60s and 70s, mostly poor African American women were turned away from the local hospitals and sent to Jackson for their health needs, and even to deliver their babies. Needless to say, many of those women couldn't get to Jackson when they needed to give birth, and so instead, they showed up at my mother-in-law's house, and she delivered their babies, dozens of them. I'll add an anecdote. The other day, Randy met a middle-aged African-American man who she delivered and named him Randy. So they're now Facebook friends. She never turned anyone away, and Randy helped with the deliveries up until the time he went to college in 1974. Affordable and professional health care should be available to everyone, period. End of story. Jean Joyner embodied the change we all should aspire to and so desperately need in the world. Once again, change happens only when courageous people take on the power behind the status quo. Being the change isn't necessarily easy because it often requires a little courage. None of these women I've just mentioned started a movement. They simply participated in something we often describe as doing the right thing. But by doing the right thing, each of them played a valuable role in movements already underway to improve the lives of women and, by extension, make our world a more just place. When we follow their example and use them as our inspiration, and we do the right thing, whatever it may be, we probably won't see the broader fruits of our labor, but we will be a vital part of justice unfolding in the world. Be the change. Have courage. Do the right thing. Just remember, change takes time. It always has, and it always will. Even so, sometimes being the change, doing the right thing, grows into something more, something we can all see and appreciate. Now I'll put my spotlight on 3 very courageous women who actively embraced the justice causes they were or are still fighting for. And through their collective actions, our world is without a doubt a better and more just world simply because of them. The first woman I'll tell you about kept showing up as the author of readings I was considering for potential sermons. I didn't know this woman, but when someone shows up over and over again, I have to believe the universe is trying to get my attention, and it did. Reverend Stephen Schick, a UU minister, says this about her in his book, Be the Change. Nature provides ready metaphors for peace and justice. Jesus' peaceful kingdom is described as a mustard seed that grows into a large bush, providing shelter to all. The Hebrew prophet Amos cried for justice to roll down like water, and we sing, I've got peace like a river and strength like a mountain. But it takes more than mere words to join nature to action. Truly experiencing ourselves as a force of nature in all its varied circumstances is something beyond just symbolism. Officials laughed when Wangari Maathai said that the women of her country would plant 15 million trees. The natural strength of the trees they planted began flowing through the women who planted them, and they discovered their own power. Through the simple planting of trees, women who lived in poverty and despair began to transform the landscape and themselves. The trees help reduce soil erosion and water pollution. They provided shade and produced sustainable crops. Wangari Maathai's vision transformed the landscape of Kenya, and the Greenbelt movement she started has spread to more than 30 countries. Growing and producing enough food for their families gave Kenyan women a greater vision and unexpected courage. They began to challenge their leaders' dictatorial and environmentally destructive policies. They faced brutal oppression with a strength they could not have imagined when the first trees were planted. When you plant a tree and you see it grow, Mathai says, something happens to you. You want to protect it and you value it. The same thing happens with a vision. Mathai was born in 1940, and her photo is on the cover of your order of service. She was a Kenyan environmental and political activist, and also a Nobel Prize winner. She was educated in the United States at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as the University of Nairobi in Kenya. In 1977, Mathai and her husband separated, and after a lengthy separation, her husband filed for divorce in 1979. He believed she was too strong-minded for a woman, and he was unable to control her. Also in 1977, Mathai founded the Green Belt Movement, an environmental, non-governmental organization focused on planting trees, environmental conservation, and women's rights. She obviously didn't let her personal problems or challenges limit her in any way. Over the intervening years, the Green Belt Movement has planted over 50 million trees, an almost unimaginable number, benefiting us all. In 1984, she was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, and in 2004, she became the first African woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for her contribution to sustainable development, democracy, and peace. Sadly, in 2011, Mathai died of complications from ovarian cancer. Without a doubt, Wangari Maathai was a beautiful and powerful force for change, and the world should never forget. Being the change is never easy, and meaningful change takes time. The second woman I'll tell you about is actually a very young woman. She said the following: "There are many problems, but I think there is a solution to all of these problems, and it's just one, and it's education." She is obviously profound and direct. You probably know her, but let me tell you a little bit more about her before I give you her name. She was born to a Pashtun family in Pakistan, where her family came to run a chain of schools in the region. She considers Benazir Bhutto as one of her role models, but she was also inspired by her father's thoughts and his humanitarian work. In early 2009, when she was only 11 or 12, she wrote a blog under a pseudonym for the BBC, detailing her life during the Taliban occupation of the area called the Swat. The following summer, journalist Adam Ellick made a New York Times documentary about her life as the Pakistani military intervened in the region. She rose in prominence and was nominated for the International Children's Peace Prize by activist Desmond Tutu. This amazing young woman is Malala Yousafzai. Fluent in Pashto, Urdu, and English, Malala was educated mostly by her father, who is a poet, a school owner, and an educational activist himself, running a chain of private schools known as the Kushal Public School. Malala started speaking about education rights as early as 2008, when her father took her to Peshawar to speak at the local press club. "How dare the Taliban take away my basic right to education," Malala exclaimed in a speech covered by newspapers and television channels throughout the region. As Malala became more recognized, the dangers facing her increased. Death threats against her were published in the newspapers and slipped under her door. On Facebook, where she was an active user, she began to receive threats. Eventually, a Taliban spokesman said they were forced to act. In a meeting held in the summer of 2012, Taliban leaders unanimously agreed to kill her. On October 9th, 2012, a Taliban gunman shot Malala as she rode home on a bus after taking an exam in Pakistan's Swat Valley. Malala was 15 years old at the time. According to reports, a masked gunman shouted, "Which one of you is Malala? Speak up, otherwise I will shoot you all." And upon being identified, Malala was shot with one bullet, which traveled 18 inches from the side of her left eye through her neck and landed in her shoulder. 2 other girls were also wounded in the shooting, both of whom were stable enough following the shooting to speak to reporters and provide details of the attack. The murder attempt received worldwide media coverage and produced an outpouring of sympathy and anger. Protests against the shooting were held in several Pakistani cities the day after the attack, and over 2 million people signed the Right to Education campaign's petition, which led to ratification of the first Right to Education bill in Pakistan. After Malala recovered and absolutely undeterred, she continued her advocacy for the rights of girls to simply be educated. On October 10th, 2014, Malala was announced as the co-recipient of the 2014 Nobel Peace Prize for her struggle against the suppression of children and young children and for the right of all children to an education. Having received the prize at the age of 17, Malala is the youngest Nobel laureate and the second Pakistani to receive a Nobel Prize. Malala embodies the courage for change we desperately need around the world. Once again, being the change is never easy, and actual change won't happen overnight. The last woman I'll profile was the youngest child of Tom D'Alessandro, who was an amazing political character in Baltimore. He was a congressman during the New Deal era, and then following that, he was the mayor of Baltimore. The D'Alessandro household in the Little Italy neighborhood of Baltimore was regularly visited by Democrats passing through from Washington, D.C. or Maryland. It was the go-to place. And so Nancy D'Alessandro grew up with politics in her DNA. Her older brother, Tom Jr., later became mayor of Baltimore. By the time she moved to San Francisco to marry Paul Pelosi in 1969, she was already not just a committed Democrat, but one who understood machine politics, the art of getting backstage deals done, and then upon moving to San Francisco, she quickly became an organizer, a fundraiser, and an activist within the California Democratic circles. After several years, she essentially ran the California Democratic Party, organized the 1984 Democratic Convention, and was the head of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, all while raising 5 children. She didn't run for Congress until 1987 when she was 46 years old. Up till that point, she was essentially a party operative, an activist, and a fundraiser. As the only daughter with several brothers, Nancy Pelosi had no illusions about what it's like to be in a male-dominated arena. It wasn't her proclivity to complain. Back then, sexism was almost institutionalized in Congress. When Pelosi came to Washington, there were only a couple of dozen women evenly divided between the Republican and Democratic Party. In a body of 435 people, they were a puny minority. And those who were there were treated as dames, as broads, as pieces of meat, and were not given the best committee assignments. Pelosi has an expression she's very fond of saying: "No one gives you power. You have to take it from them." And she proceeded to do just that. She slowly made her way up the chain. After a couple of terms, she convinced party leadership to give her a committee slot on the House Appropriations Committee. And then she established her national security experience and credentials on the House Intelligence Committee. After she excelled in those committee assignments, she began to look for leadership positions in the party. Even so, she wasn't welcomed. They didn't invite her to any meetings. In fact, the only time she'd ever been in the speaker's office was when she became speaker herself. And when she decided to run for a leadership position, specifically for whip, they basically said, "It's not your turn," and asked why she was doing this. One of her replies was that it was important to have a woman at the table. They in turn said to her, "Well, why don't you just make a list of the things that you women here in Congress want done, and we'll just do them for you." Remember, this was not the 1800s. This was about 2001. It's obvious the Democratic Party and its leaders had a long way to go. Later, as a leader, she understood that you're only as good as the caucus that's united behind you. And you can't simply do that by cracking the whip and breaking fingers. What's made her an effective leader is simply her willingness to sit and listen as one colleague after the next talks to her about the political pressures they face and the needs of their district. And so Pelosi, as a result of this, has a remarkable institutional memory of all those disparate voices within her caucus. And that she is responsive to those voices is probably the most important aspect of what has made her so effective. But she also has a keen sense of where a center would be that would hold. And at the same time, she's not just an empty-headed pragmatist. She began with a belief system, certain things that she felt the party needed to accomplish. For instance, her first speech on the House floor was about the AIDS crisis that was consuming San Francisco. And later, she was passionate about Tiananmen Square, and she was a vocal opponent of the Iraq War from start to finish. And as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, she was given the latest intelligence on weapons of mass destruction, and frankly, she was unimpressed by what she saw, and she conveyed that to others. Many of her peers maintain there would be no Affordable Care Act if Nancy Pelosi hadn't been Speaker of the House. It passed by just 3 votes, and she secured those votes. There were a lot of people saying to Speaker Pelosi, "Let's settle for much less. Let's just get in and get out. To pass something like on pre-existing conditions and call it a day." Pelosi said, "No. We are here to do something major. We're going to do something major." And Pelosi achieved something major with the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Around 20 million working and poor Americans now have health care who didn't have it before. People with pre-existing conditions are protected. It expanded Medicaid to low-income families, and it allowed young adults up to 26 to stay on their parents' plans. Even when she transitioned to leader of the minority, some say she did her best work in those years. What Pelosi would do was ensure there were enough House Democrats, specifically 146, which is just a little more than 1/3. And with that 1/3, she could sustain a presidential veto. Meaning that if the House Republicans passed something and it managed to go through the Senate and also get passed and arrived at President Obama's desk, he could veto it. And then there would be still enough Democrat votes to sustain that veto. And doing so, she protected the Affordable Care Act from almost countless assaults on it by the Republicans. Obama said of Pelosi, "I think Nancy Pelosi, when the history is written, will go down as one of the most effective legislative leaders that this country has ever known. Her skill, tenacity, toughness, vision is remarkable. Her stamina, her ability to see around corners, her ability to stand her ground and do hard things and to suffer unpopularity to get the right thing done, I think stands up against any person that I've observed or worked directly with in Washington during my life." Pelosi clearly is a remarkable person. She is the change we need, given her integrity, her willingness to fight for the marginalized, and her determination to provide tangible support for those who often have none. Nothing has ever come easy in her fight for change because the status quo abhors change. Her determination and her courage in the face of overwhelming odds is the definition of being the change we want to see in the world. In fact, all the women I've profiled personify the positive changes we desperately need in this world, and their courage simply reminds us that change will never be easy. The powers that be don't want to share power. Nevertheless, change is happening. Positive, life-affirming change. And it's happening because people like you and I simply find and embrace the courage we need to be the change we want to see in the world. Amen and namaste.
Thanks for listening to the UUC of Tupelo's podcast. You can find us at uuctupeloms.org, on Facebook by searching for UUC Tupelo, or contact us by email at uuctupelocom@gmail.com. That's uuctupelocom@gmail.com. The UUC of Tupelo is a welcoming congregation who accept all people, regardless of creed, color, national origin, gender, or gender identity. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and as you head on your way, go in peace, believe in peace, create peace.